Hello, everybody. It seems that Sarah and I are almost continually on Facebook Live at the moment. It's almost my second life, if we could describe it in that way. And in fact, in many ways, the very life that we're living at the moment reflects the subject matter of today's discussion, which is the incredible writer Philip K. Dick. Now, as many of you will know, or some of you may not know, around about 5 or 6 years ago, I was asked to write a biography of Philip K. Dick by my publisher. Now, this was unusual for me because ordinarily what would happen is that I would suggest to one of my publishers an idea I had for a book. But my publisher, Arcturus, was really quite intrigued by a couple of chapters I'd written in previous books on Philip K. Dick. And they said to me, we think that there is sufficient market here for a book just on Philip K. Dick, and particularly your angle on Philip K. Dick. And I thought, it's quite an interesting idea. I think I'll go ahead with this. And then, after I finished writing the book, we decided to call it Philip K. Dick, The Man Who Remembered the Future. Now, the reason we chose to do this, or the reason I chose to do this, was quite specific. Because to me, I believe that Philip K. Dick was a precog, as he called some of his characters. And I believe there is an awful lot of evidence to suggest that an awful lot of his work he was precognizing. Not only that, but in many occasions he wrote plot lines which he then subsequently found himself living in reality. So we'll be discussing a little bit about this, but today our guest is a gentleman called Daniel Abella. Now, Daniel and I now know each other because Daniel interviewed me for his podcast a few weeks ago, which was an absolutely fascinating discussion and didn't last anywhere near long enough. So now we have 2.5 hours to discuss matters Philip K. Dickian. So without further ado, Daniel, tell us a little bit about yourself. Introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll get into things from there.
I'm the organizer of the Philip K. Dick Festival, now actually on its 10th anniversary, which I'm really excited about. I guess it all goes back to a film I saw years ago. Some of you might be familiar with The Fly, the original Fly, the one played by with Vincent Price. And
Yeah.
I recall, that shows how old I am, but it indicates how, well, after watching that film, I was truly intrigued by the physics behind it.
Yeah, because wasn't it fascinating as well? He had a little white head, because I remember reading that story originally, The Fly, as well. How incredible.
Yeah, and that really, I think, got me on this journey, this fascination with physics, with science, and science fiction. So that was one of the first sci-fi films I recall watching and being truly shaped and influenced by. Shortly afterwards, I wanted to create a machine like the Fly. I wanted to create a machine, not so much to hybridize men and insects, but to create a machine where you could teleport somebody to another place. So I was really fascinated by that possibility. And from there on, I became interested in physics and science and hard sciences. But at the same time, I was always fascinated by science fiction. So you could say that I've continued that interest for many, many years, and almost a parallel streak. And I felt that science fiction really was, even then, was basically the science of tomorrow. That's what I like to believe it. It is a place where you basically remove the blinkers and be able to see the future without any restriction, without any kind of judgments. So it often turns out to be closer to the truth than we like it to believe. So in my journey, I studied physics. I went to Columbia University, and where I majored in physics and biochemistry.
Mm.
And during that time, I joined the Filmmakers Club, and continued to immerse myself in the world of filmmaking. I remember seeing Tarkovsky's Solaris, and I was just blown away. I mean, I thought this is really. Let me backtrack a little bit. I saw 2001. That really, absolutely floored me. But then followed with Tarkovsky's Solaris and Stanislav Lem. And I thought, this is really something. This is a new way of filmmaking, a new way of introducing concepts which normally would be only allowed or permissible in a text form. But here is done it cinematically. I graduated from Columbia, and from then on, for a few years, I joined. Well, I became an investment advisor for Wall Street. I worked for a biotech firm, and then somewhere around 2000, 1999, 2000, I became really interested in film as a medium for getting the word out. And it's a platform for introducing ideas which might normally be unentertaining in a more academic format. So I took several courses. I enrolled here at NYU Film School, and the first thing I wanted to do is, well, I want to make a film. I started doing some shorts. I said, no, I gotta go. I always had been fascinated by this film that was with Lloyd Bridges called The Deadly Dream. This is back in the late 80s or maybe late 70s, early 80s, about a man whose reality seems to be parallel to what's happening to his dream in his dreams, that his dream and reality are both one and the same. So I took that subject and became the subject of a feature film called, and I coined it The Final Equation. A man who discovers finally Einstein's field theory, Einstein's unified field theory, but by doing so, he unlocks a key to a parallel universe. And the film, I ran it and had it shown in a couple of festivals. And then shortly afterwards, I realized that there was a writer who had explored these very same concepts, Philip K. Dick. This is around 2010 or thereabouts. And I started reading, and I came across a quotation by Ursula K. Le Guin. She said, Philip K. Dick is our own homegrown Borges. Now, I've been a big follower of Borges for many years. My father actually was the one who introduced me to, and I thought Borges had a streak of the metaphysical, the philosophical. And usually, let's face it, philosophy is generally a fairly dry subject, at least the way it's written about. But here is Borges, and later on Philip K. Dick, introducing philosophy and themes that usually would be in a philosophical environment, more in a literary, novelistic environment. I was absolutely enthralled. I read everything that he did, his most recent works. Valles, Radio Free Albemuth, Transmigration of Timothy Archer, Divine Invasion. And then started working backwards, which is generally the opposite of what most people do. And so around 2011, 2012, we decided to put together a festival in honor of Philip K. Dick, a festival which would exemplify the themes that, in my opinion, run through his works, like what does it mean to be human? Who are we? What is the nature of reality? What is consciousness? And also, the point of the festival was not just to be another sci-fi festival, because God knows there are plenty of them out there, but to be a platform for introducing a meta-narrative about where we're going as a culture, as a society, and also about the transcendent experiences people are having all day, every day, not just Philip K. Dick. So our first festival took place in December, December 12th, 2012, only a few days before the famous or more infamous Mayan calendar shift. And basically I did it, and it was great. I mean, we had a fantastic lineup. We showed Radio Free Albemuth, John Allen Simon's Radio Free Albemuth, and it was really exciting. It was thrilling, truly, to have films from all over the world shown there. And
that's an actual wonderful link, that, actually, because a previous guest of this show was Mr. Simon. So it was fascinating chatting to him about his version of Radio Free Albemuth. So there's a nice link there with what you were doing.
Oh, absolutely. And I remember when the first time he looked at me, I was wearing a goatee. I was he looked at me like, is this guy a PKD? Because I guess PKD people are supposed to look a certain way. So I just let it say, well, listen, because I came across more as a businessman at that time. Because I flew him over from LA with his producer. And but at the end of the weekend, he knew that I was definitely a PKD, a core PKD. And we've stayed friends since then. The PKD Festival has since then blossomed. That we do one in New York every year, but we've been invited to show some of those films in Poland, in Amsterdam, in Germany. We've been doing one in Germany up until last year, and in France. So, and everywhere we go, we always see people that are really fascinated by Philip K. Dick. I mean, our audiences are enthralled by his ideas and what he represents. And in the course of many years, we've had amazing panels dealing with those themes. And it's really something that I'm very excited about. And I'm truly shocked that 10 years have passed. Really, I started doing the numbers 2012, 2013. No, it's 10 years. It's amazing. So here we are on our 10th anniversary, coming hopefully July 2021.
Wow, that is incredible. And to actually do it for 10 years as well is extraordinary. And interestingly enough, one of the things that does fascinate me about Philip K. Dick is how much the French have taken to him. I did a TV documentary for French and German television a few years ago, where I was interviewed, so was Rutger Hauer, Tessa Dick, and various other people. And I was very intrigued. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but it was really quite funny. Somebody contacted me on Facebook around about 6 or 7 months ago. And he sent me a short piece from a TV series called Le Baron Noir, which is a very popular TV series in France. And there's a sequence where this guy, who's a top politician, is moving out of his flat in Paris, and he's moving all his books out of one suitcase into another. And as he's doing so, he picks up one of the books, and it's this. And my French version of Philip K. Dick. And he looks at the book, and they have a small discussion about it, and about Philip K. Dick and reality. And I always thought it's almost like mirrors. And again, your reference to Borges, Jorge Borges, and how Borges does this as well, doesn't it? The idea of mirrors and reality reflecting itself. And I was thinking, this is how strange this is. There is a book that I've written on a TV program in a language I don't understand, and the message has been given to me by somebody else. And that's the wonderful thing, isn't it? As we said in our interview, we're all living in a Philip K. Dick world at the moment, particularly with COVID lockdown and things. But let's move on a little bit. Before we get on to the philosophy, what does Philip K. Dick mean to you? Clearly, there's lots of other science fiction writers. Why is it that of all the science fiction writers, Philip K. Dick is the one that really shook your tree?
Well, I think Philip K. Dick, first of all, I believe the name's Peake, the messenger. I was drawn to that name before I ever knew anything about Philip K. Dick. There was something strange. I mean, there's something about this person, about this writer. And not until years later that I began to realize that we had a shared view of the world. To me, Philip K. Dick is not just a sci-fi writer. He's someone who lived his experiences. He's not creating a world just purely from his imagination, but it's from a lived reality, which he wanted to transmit, maybe perhaps consciously or unconsciously, to the rest of the world. And he used the medium of speculative fiction, which is really what he was writing, not science fiction, but speculative fiction, to get his words out. And he did so in a way that is far more accessible than had he chosen to write a book on philosophy or the nature of reality, which for a lot of people, they'll never pick up. So he's kind of a modern day prophet for me, more than, say, Arthur C. Clarke, which I love, or Isaac Asimov or Heinlein. More than any other writer, I think Philip K. Dick has a finger on the pulse of what's going on right now. He also was very deeply concerned about the current divorce between science and spirituality. Which is leading, in his opinion, seems to be leading us towards a very dark place in history. He felt that I believe, and as I read his works, I believe a lot of it is this idea that we have to retain our humanity while developing these technologies, and not so much be enthralled, seduced by technology as the end all and be all of the salvation of humanity, which seems to be really what's going on today. I'll give you a perfect example. When glasses like this were designed, they were meant to improve our eyesight. So at some point, you would just throw them away. But now they're designed in such a way that now you need a stronger pair of lenses. See the differences between technology being to improve our own natural senses and technology designed to weaken us and pull us down a rabbit hole. So I think more than any other writer, he represents a voice from the unconscious, from his unconscious, not just someone who's writing about future worlds and rocket ships to other planets, but what's happening to us right now as human beings. And it's a warning from we still have, there's still a possibility of correcting the course, but the time is really running short for us.
Because that's a very interesting analysis, isn't it? Because I know Phil himself was very concerned about the political situation right through from the late 60s, you know, his issues with Nixon and everything else as well. And in a lot of his novels, he very much put the political viewpoint across. Now, in terms of what was the first Philip K. Dick book you read? You know, you obviously had heard the name, and then you think, I'm going to read one of his books. You described some of them. So which was the first one? Can you tell us about it?
Oh, Valles.
Okay. Tell us about Valles, because it's an amazing book, one of my favourites. Tell us about Valles, the themes in Valles, and how they resonated with you.
Well, Valles was for me, first of all, the first thing that struck me about Valles was the various characters, the fragmentation, or the way Philip K. Dick represented himself in Valles, the various characters within the work. What attracted me initially was the Gnostic and philosophical implications that this parallel reality, this reality which really is sort of a simulation of a much deeper underlying reality, and attempts by the author to really discover what that reality is through various characters. So it's almost like Valles is an attempt by Phil to explore his own psychology, to really look at himself and breaking down the various characters and how they interact with each other and the various types of exposition and how they relate to that. As I read the book, I didn't read it with the attempt to create or come up with a very specific narrative, a very specific step-by-step action plan, but more as what is the philosophical current behind that? So usually, if you were to ask me today, well, where does it start, where does it end? For me, it's a little bit blurry because there are characters that come in, but my assimilation of Valles was at a more philosophical level, which was how does a character explain the nature of reality, and how he sometimes he has a skeptic, he has various approaches. It's almost like he's both the spectator and the actor at the same time. So it really resonated at a level which is still, I would say, almost pre-linguistic, that I said, this is something that I really want. It's almost like reading a work of theology in a way, Valles, but far more interesting. That's how I interpret it.
Because it was a fascinating book in the sense of the characters he had, you know, Horse Lover Fat as a character. And of course, again, being typical Phil, he's punning here. He's punning with Greek, you know, horse lover, Phil Hippus, and fat, which is German. Dick is German for fat, so that's him. But you also have the writer in it, don't you? Philip K. Dick, the writer, who's also a character in it. And then you have these wonderful odd characters that turn up and drop in. For instance, the rock band Mother Goose, which always, you know, the way you find that your life seems to come round in synchronicities. Because one of my favourite records of all time is a song called Mother Goose by Jethro Tull. And I can only assume that that is the song he was referring to when he called the band Mother Goose. But of course, the main guy, isn't it, was supposed to be David Bowie.
That's right.
And I can't remember that character's name. You probably will remember it. But it's the way in which the characters, as you say, it's the fragmentation of Phil's personality within the novel. And you know, I would argue it's almost him talking about his daemon and his eidolon.
Right.
And the idea that his personality, there's somebody else that's communicating with him, almost as an observer to himself as well. You know, and then we have all that really strange Gnostic themes, don't we? Whereby there is the young girl Sophia and her involvement as well. Can you say a little bit about Gnosticism as you interpret it, particularly because you use the term, and I know there'll be some people out there who will get immediately what you mean by Gnosticism, but what are you talking about when you say that Phil is a very Gnostic writer? Can you tell a little bit more about that?
Right. So Gnosticism is for me, represents a way of knowing that is more embodied, it's more experiential, rather than academic or mental. Let's say when I say I know God, it doesn't mean I feel it, I experience God internally in my body. I don't experience it as a concept, as an idea, as an image. So for Gnosticism, there clearly is we can talk about historical roots of Gnosticism, but I'm not referring to that specifically. I think there's this idea that the reality can be filtered through our senses, but also can be filtered through our body as well, and that's where real wisdom comes in. So, and that's more of a deeper kind of wisdom, than the kind of wisdom you might pick up from reading a book on, say, philosophy or literature and so on. So for me, Gnosticism is a perception, a direct perception into the nature of reality, as much as we can as humans, rather than some sort of concept that we make up and go about trying to convert or change others. For instance, I was just thinking about this last night. The early first Christians. The first Christians, we're talking about the ones just after Jesus, first century. There must have been something that it was definitely a Gnostic experience. For many of them to lay down their lives cannot have been simply because, oh, I heard, or this guy tells me. They must have experienced something at a very deep level that made them do the things that they did. Now, unfortunately, after many, many centuries, that Gnostic experience seemed to fade away and was replaced by dogma, by catechisms, by more academic-based thinking rather than an embodied soul experience. And I believe when Philip K. Dick talks about, when I'm referring to Gnostic view of the world, it's a direct perception of reality. I think you kind of allude to that in your book on opening the doors of perception. It's kind of an awakening where the world opens up before you, and you really see the nature of what's happening, rather than being seduced or deceived by these various agents that want to keep you asleep. So that's my experience of Gnosticism.
No, I think that was an excellent description of it. You know, the idea of trying to explain theophany, where the early Christians had this problem of evil, and why an essentially good God could create evil and suffering. You know, the idea of how can a good God create a world where a child dies of cancer in agony? And of course, the Gnostics came along and said, well, there's a very simple explanation for this. The God that of the Old Testament that's smiting people all over the place and killing people and saying there are no gods before me because I am a jealous God, which in itself is a contradiction, because how can God be jealous of anything if he's the singular God? And they picked up on that, didn't they? And they decided that the creator of this universe, Yaldabaoth, or whatever they termed him to be, was the false creator, was the demiurge that has created a false universe that we are trapped within. And of course, gnosis from the Greek, you know, is knowledge, self-knowledge, and of course, Sophia is wisdom. And it's the idea that we see through the facade of this reality. And I think Philip K. Dick is one of the few writers that really goes for that. And I think this is again the link, isn't it, with Borges? You know, and you read a lot of Borges's work, you know, the circular ruins and the Library of Babel. and Hume's The Memoirs. They're all to do with, again, realities behind realities. And it clearly Phil was quite interested in this, which leads us along quite nicely to the idea of science fiction as philosophy. You know, an awful lot of people who do not read science fiction do not realize that it's in fact probably one of the most intellectually demanding sometimes form of fiction, isn't it? Would you like to talk a little bit about that, the idea of the relationship between not just Phil per se, but other science fiction writers as well, and how philosophy imbues a lot of these themes?
Well, I think science fiction is a platform for introducing ideas which ordinarily might not be palatable to the average lay person, or just understandable. It's a framework for that. And a lot of the both cinematic and text-based science fiction, I find that the concepts are more interesting than the little plot lines they want to develop. So for whether or not the character turns, say in The Fly, turns into a little bug, a hybridized bug, it's not so interesting to me as the concepts behind that, by creating a sort of the physics, let's say, the science behind that. So it's no accident that a lot of writers, a lot of scientists attribute science fiction as their impetus for getting into the world of science. For instance, I'm actually interviewing Ronald Mallett, not for the fourth time. He's currently a physicist, tenured physicist at University of Connecticut, is working on a way of sending particles back in time. Mm-hmm. And the physics, according to him, the physics it's doable. It's absolutely doable. Now, tell me about something that is no more sci-fi than a time machine. And yet, you would think that, and this guy, I've interviewed him several times, and he basically he was inspired by a science fiction book, A Time Machine. And the story is very moving. It's about when he was young, he was in his like 8 or 9 years old. He saw his father pass away from a heart attack right in front of him. And he was, for many, many years, he was very depressed and wondering what happened. And he had, it's very sad. And then one day he comes across this book called The Time Machine. And then after reading it, it occurred to him perhaps he could build a machine that he could go back in time and warn his father about his impending death. And then I guess this was in his teens, he realized that was not possible. But he nevertheless became interested in physics and studied physics and got his PhD, joined the army. Eventually, sometime later on in his life, he realized there were certain loopholes in Einstein's field equations that allow for a possibility of time travel, not through a wormhole, but by actually spinning lasers, by spinning light in a circular form. You could create a kind of a vortex. And this is back when he was well established as a tenured professor. So he decided to go ahead and now revisit that, an old quest. Now he's still yet to get funding for that, because part of the premise is first you gotta drag space and then you gotta drag time. So the common idea is that there's no way we can create a time machine because it needs tons and tons and tons of energy. Well, that's the old paradigm. He believes that there are certain things in quantum physics that we can still discover, yet to be discovered, that allowed for time travel without that massive expenditure of energy. Now, his story is absolutely a perfect example of how science fiction can shape scientists. It is the theme, it's a human theme where we can, through humanity, we get to really make these ideas embodied in our soul. So it's not just a concept. It's not something you debate in your head, but you becomes part of who you are, and you radiate that kind of that intensity. So I use them as a perfect example, and I'm sure there are many writers and scientists out there who can trace their interest in science to science fiction. It opens the door to the imagination more than any other field. I'll give you a perfect example of another writer you're probably very familiar with. This guy, you're familiar. I'm sure you can.
I certainly am. Yes, yes. He wrote something about my first book. He's a wonderful man, Colin Wilson.
Brilliant man. He actually picked this copy at Watkins back in 1999. You can tell.
Watkins Bookshop.
Yes, is it
in London? Yeah, no, I've done one of my publishers is Watkins, and I've done 4 book launches at Watkins Bookshop in London.
So I read this. Now I've always been a big believer in philosophy, but after reading this, it kind of reintroduced me to philosophy. But it took someone like Colin Wilson to reignite my interest in philosophy. Because up until then, when I read Jean-Paul Sartre, let's say La Nausée, it was very boring. And it's something very weird and twisted about and I couldn't, there is a quote from Nietzsche, don't look at the philosophy, look at the philosopher. And that always sticks with me, because when, say, Jean-Paul Sartre has this experience of La Nausée, when he starts to look at reality, there's not in it, and it's almost like an insectoid kind of nausea. That's his version of reality. That is not reality with a capital R. So he was still, as a human, filtering reality, even though he come to be a philosopher in his through his own filters, through which were supposedly a very sad early childhood. So here, Colin Wilson says that doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be that you need to look at reality one way. You need to look at the filters. And it's an amazing book. So this got me reintroduced to reality, and I started reading more philosophy and understand that the philosophy is best communicated through books like this, through the writer.
Totally. I mean, the thing is with Colin Wilson, isn't it? Rather like yourself. I mean, his book, The Outsider, was profoundly influential on me in my late teens. And funnily enough, there's a lot of parallels here, because the first book, when I went away to university, my then girlfriend, Christina, in her infinite wisdom, gave me a copy of La Nausée as a book to read when you're alone, you're away from home for the first time. And I sat in my little room in the halls of residence and read that book. And it was a profound introduction to really a novel that made me think incredibly deeply. And I had been a science fiction reader up until then, almost exclusively, science fiction and horror. And then suddenly there was this novel that was making me think differently about the nature of what it is to be human, and the way in which the character, the way he has revulsion about the things that are normal in his life. And again, from another point you were making there, which I was also reminded of, and I was going to say this as well, that of course we talk about The Fly, and it's considered to be a science fiction novel. But of course, you take it back, and Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis is a man who wakes up and has turned into an insect. Now, it is obviously an arbitrary thing to decide that Kafka is a great writer and is not a science fiction writer, whereas the guy that wrote The Fly was a science fiction writer. So it's a very arbitrary demarcation, isn't it, as to what this means? And of course, Colin Wilson wrote that incredible book, The Space Vampires.
Yes, I have that too. I have also at Watkins.
Oh, really?
I have that. And the Mind Parasites.
The Mind Parasites, wasn't that extraordinary?
That's really one of the few books that it should have been made into a movie.
Yeah, because they made The Space Vampires into a movie, didn't they? And it was a disaster.
Yes, it was called Life Force.
Life Force, correct.
Right.
Because I discussed that with Colin over a few emails a few years ago. And he really hated it for obvious reasons, because they'd made such a mess of it. Do you know Gary Lachman, by the way?
I have several of his books. I don't know him personally.
Okay. Because Gary was a really good friend of Colin Wilson's, and in fact, I was Colin was going to come to one of my book launches a few years ago, but because he really left Cornwall towards the end of his life. But Gary spent a lot of time down there with him. And both Gary and myself, because Gary and I have become quite good friends. By the way, guys, Gary was originally Gary Valentine, who was the guitarist of Blondie, in the initial Blondie band. And in fact, again, he's been a previous guest on this show. But Gary's a fascinating writer. But Gary was saying about Colin Wilson, and of course you look at Colin Wilson's writing, and then you get the background from Colin Wilson to Camus, because you read The Outsider, and when you're reading The Outsider, you're going, this is L'Étranger, or it is the Rebel, in the same way. But Wilson does it far better. And I've always based my writing style upon Colin Wilson, as does Gary Lachman. I feel that when somebody reads one of your books, they've got to, even if they don't agree with what you say, they feel that I've really learned something. And I try on every page, I will put a factoid in there that somebody will go, wow, I didn't know that. Because all of us, we're all information junkies, aren't we? And we all want this little bit of obscure, and you've already proven yourself to be that already, that we love this little snippets of information that enlighten your life, that makes your life more interesting. It's not trying to show off. It's more than that, because the universe is fascinating. And your idea there about your associate and the time machine, and I was thinking, this is very much like, there's a guy called John Kramer, and Kramer has something called, you probably know it as a physicist, the top-down hypothesis, whereby, is it the top-down? No, that was Stephen Hawking and Frank Hartle, the transactional analysis of particle physics. And he argues that effectively there are retarded waves and advanced waves, and subatomic particles are either carried along by an advanced wave or a retarded wave, and advanced waves are going forward in time and retarded waves are going backwards. I might have got that the wrong way round, but that's the theory. And the idea is that the present moment is literally the interaction creating a holographic reality of retarded waves and advanced waves causing an interference pattern, which is the present moment. But if you were able to ride on a retard and one of the particles going backwards in time, almost kind of like tachyons almost, I suppose, you could go backwards in time. Because of course, as you will know far more than me, time in quantum physics terms, there is no arrow of time. It can go in either direction because it's not part of quantum physics, is it?
Well, the way, yes, there are various interpretations of time, and in my book, they're at the end of the day, you can create a working model. Then you'll be able to test which version is more useful to our human experience. Give me 1 second. It's freezing in here in this room. It's 23 degrees Celsius, Fahrenheit, so it's got to be maybe about 0 degrees.
Sarah in Rat Mansion over there probably will agree with that, I think.
It's rather cold in this room.
She's normally wrapped up, aren't you, Sarah? Normally wrapped up because you're so cold.
Yeah, I've got a blanket in Rat Mansion.
Yeah, it's about, I would say -2, -3 outside Celsius. So it's a bit nippy out here. So there are various models of quantum mechanics, right? And you have the Copenhagen model, you have the pilot wave model, you have the multiple universe model, and each one of them has a slightly different take on the nature of reality. But I think that one thing that I studied years ago is some of the general semantics and the idea. You heard of the expression "the map is not the territory" by Count Kaczynski, and basically these are all descriptive models of reality, but there is no one specific model that encapsulates all of reality. So when it comes to time travel or time, what the nature of time, we can also apply that same kind of reasoning. That clearly, at the way we can ground these models into an actionable system is by creating, let's say in the case of Ronald Mallett, creating a machine or some sort of way of demonstrating whether or not this is doable or not. Until then, they're all basically equally valid in my book. So let's say, for instance, I ran this by Dr. Mallett, is the concept of parallel universes. So in his version, let's say you create a time machine at let's say at 12 noon. He started, right? And eventually, and then you send a particle back in time, let's say at 12:30. The best you can do is detect whether or not there's something that happens at 12 noon. You cannot go back beyond the actual inception of the machine. This is based upon how the time works. However, I asked him, what if there's a what if there is a machine built in a parallel universe where you can send a, then he thought that might be a possibility. That is, what if there's a reality next to ours is almost identical, except at this reality, a time machine or a time portal or machine has been built. Then theoretically, you can build a particle back. So when you create that time travel machine, the particle would go to the parallel universe instead of.
In which case, you wouldn't get the grandfather paradox and everything else, because you'd get round that, wouldn't you? Yeah.
So this might be a way of exploring what, whether or not there are parallel universes or how close they are to us. So right now, the physics has become highly speculative. Right now, we're talking about multiple realities, holographic universes, and it gets really, it's almost like spinning out of control, right? So we got to ground ourselves in creating actionable models so we can test this. Say superstring versus loop quantum gravity. So which one is really the way to go? So a lot of physicists say the superstring presumably explains all reality, but yet it's not provable because a lot of these experiments to detect these string particles will require massive amounts of energy. So other physicists are saying, let's look back at loop quantum gravity. And so right now they're just various models, and I'm not necessarily wedded to any one of them. They're very interesting. But at the end of the day, I really am a strong believer in actionable intelligence.
Right.
Let's say, we got to always return back to what the ancients talked about, Jesus and Buddha, about relieving the suffering of people. The suffering of human beings is key. And how do you have, we can know all this stuff, but people are still suffering and they still have to deal with the challenges of what it means to be human. What can you offer them as a sort of consolation, as a sort of relief from that? And that's so important because this way we're reintegrating the human into the science rather than venturing into these realms, which are very interesting from a cognitive point of view. But from a human point of view, they kind of leave something there that is missing. So actionable models might be useful in helping us deal with the core questions of what it means to be human, which is something that Philip K. Dick talked about, which is, according to him, empathy was a basic quality of humanity. I had a chance to talk with Colin Wilson and Robert Anton Wilson.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, that was back in the mid '90s. Robert Anton Wilson toured with another writer, I would say, not philosopher, but it's hard to describe. He's sort of a scientist, Richard Bandler.
Don't know him.
No, and he. So I got a chance to meet with Robert Anton Wilson twice during the lectures, and he mentioned that later in his life, Philip K. Dick felt there was a way to break out of the black iron prison, and he didn't really. At that time, he was becoming very familiar with the works of general semantics, language, epistemology, and there was a way he felt to break out of that of the web of deception that exists around us. So Robert Anton Wilson, unfortunately, as we all know, PKD passed away before he really was able to develop that philosophy. But I think there was the possibility of something there that could help us, what I refer to as tools of liberation, to break us from the pattern of deception that keeps going on. One thing I want to mention is this, back to your original question, how science fiction is useful, is think about, let's say, The Matrix, which unfortunately, is straight, basically stolen out of the movie The Matrix. The themes are so similar to what Philip K. Dick talked about in the 70s. Think about that. Before The Matrix, nobody was talking about whether we live in a simulation or not. I mean, very few. I mean, you might have been talking about it. There were others, but most people were basically oblivious to that. Now it's become part of the parlance of scientists. Are we living in a simulation or not? So it took a movie like The Matrix, a science fiction movie, to bring this discussion to the general public. Because had some physicists had introduced The Matrix as a academic possibility, most people would not have heard of it. Now you have someone even like Neil Tyson, who actually thinks, yeah, there's a possibility we might be living in a simulation. You know, so it's another film that comes to mind is Videodrome. Did you ever watch that?
Oh yeah, was it Cronenberg?
Very powerful, very powerful. I started watching it, and it truly dramatizes what the power of technology and the seduction of violence. Which it's funny because back in the 70s, and I think Videodrome came out in the late 70s, right, or early 80s.
Yeah, early 80s, I think. Yes.
Yeah, there was this obsession how video games and were gonna create violent behavior, but yet, and they were talking about the so-called snuff films. But yet, today we have violence that is being shown graphically to people. I mean, we talk about real life violence, and they're being traumatized not by video games, not by these but by the actual drama. The violence, that real life drama. And these broadcasters are doing this without any concern about the mental impact they're having on people. So at that time, when Videodrome came out, it surely indicated this was a bad thing. There was an agenda behind that, the so-called Videodrome. So in a way, Cronenberg is not too far off his mark when he's suggesting there may be an agenda to traumatize the population with violence and graphic imagery, or desensitize them to that. This is where the real cover-up. It's not so much that whether or not we are actually in a matrix by little robots. The real cover-up is this reality. And I think this is what Philip K. Dick was so concerned.
Well, Phil became fascinated, didn't people like Baudrillard and the French philosophers, and the idea of simulacra, and the idea of what do you know if something is a facsimile copy of something? At what point does it cease to be that thing or become something different? And the French philosophers are really, really interested in this. And I think Phil, reading back through his material, he was so ahead of his time in the sense he was writing about this stuff. And he was referring to these philosophers as well. You know, when you go and you work your way through the exegesis, and you work your way through and you see a lot in here of the inception of Phil's ideas. And he had such a mercurial mind that he was almost like a sponge, and he would take in information from everywhere. And that's the sign of a genius, isn't it? Somebody who can take information and remember it and then say, let's apply that to something different. But Phil's genius then was creating stories to put across deep philosophical ideas. Like, for instance, your point before, because I didn't want to stop you because some of the things you were saying, I should be making notes here because there's so many extraordinary things you're saying here. But Phil's preoccupation with empathy, you know, and the concept of mercerism, you know, because one of the themes, everybody knows about the main themes of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and of course Blade Runner. But there's a whole other sub-theme in Blade Runner that people, because they haven't read the novel, do not get. And it's only by knowing the understanding of this religion of mercerism and the idea of getting empathy. And as I recall, isn't the guy Mercer, isn't he's climbing up through a hill or something and people are throwing stones at him and he's in pain and he's in agony. And you're supposed to empathise with his pain. And of course you extrapolate from that to say, well, how can we empathise with an android? How can we empathise in any way? And isn't that what the test is? to test the void camp test or something, wasn't it? Where you test whether somebody has empathy or not. Am I right about that? Or have I missed that point somewhere?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think he was right on the money. In fact, I found it very interesting that there's a whole new generation of AI therapists being rolled out. Literally, you're talking with an AI system. And in many instances, they found out that the patients are able to develop, the clients or patients develop a good relationship with an AI system. And they almost treat the AI as if it's a real human being. So our capacity for empathy goes beyond just humans. I mean, we can basically, it's almost like a field. So it's something that we can impact other things, non-inanimate objects as well. We can empathize with those things.
Well, and that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because one of the things that I'm very interested in at the moment, and my last book discussed this in detail, I have a concept called the egregorial. And the egregorial is that somehow there's a feedback mechanism between ourselves and an external reality, implying quantum physics, implying neurology, and everything else as well. And I'd never thought about it before. It's only when you were saying it then I was thinking, this is almost an aspect of empathy as well. You know, when somebody creates a tulpa, or the Philip experiment in the early 1970s, the idea that we can, by our own anticipations and wanting something to happen, we can bring it into existence. And we know from quantum physics, it's extraordinary, isn't it? The amount of times people think of like the muon. You know, as E. Rabi said when they discovered the muon, when he turned around and he said, "Who ordered that?" And it's like the Planck constant. You know, Planck in an act of desperation plugged in this number into his mathematical equations, and suddenly this number pops up everywhere. So is the universe mathematical? But more importantly, because we have created maths, or are we discovering maths? Is maths structures out there, or is it part of the human condition that we impose mathematical structures on the universe, which then creates the universe around us? And again, Phil was doing that, wasn't he? You know, intriguing. I'm sorry for coming in on that, but there's so many topics. My brain is exploding at the moment.
Yeah, I actually been thinking about the concept of the current, like, and this is interesting. That one thing that all the Abrahamic religions know instinctively is the importance of that, because when you have 1 billion Muslims or 1 billion Catholics out there, they create a current which we can tap into. That's something that we don't, as you know, if you're a Gnostic and you say a particular type of Gnosticism, there's really very little of a current. Crowley talked about creating the 93 current. Well, I believe it's 93. So you're creating a current because this is the joining of a billion souls, and you're bringing into existence a reality which didn't exist before. And that's an absolutely fascinating concept.
Because there's then the idea, isn't it, that you could then argue that phenomena like Fatima and the Marian visions and everything as well are raising, because the expectations of the crowds are there. So, and I've argued this in other interviews, that could this be that why people believe seemingly irrational things? Because when their group gets together, they create the egregore of that belief system. And the visual and the feedback world around them reflects those beliefs to such an extent, those beliefs become real to them. Whereas us outside of that belief system are not convinced, purely and simply because we're not within the belief system. Therefore, the egregorial consciousness of those individuals is being missed in some way.
Well, yes, and it goes back to what you mentioned in your book, Doors of Perception, is that we are, and it's very possible that the ancients, their blinkers were, they consider the otherworldly realities more commonplace than this reality. I mean, we talk about the concept of the fall, the concept of, say, Rudolf Steiner talks about that thousands of years ago, that we had atavistic vision, where you see multiple realities in front of you, something you might have if you're, say, having an acid trip or a DMT trip. But it doesn't, back then, it was possible that the inhabitants or the denizens of that period had that vision direct. So the life wasn't so severely filtered by Western analytic consciousness as it is today. So the concept of fairies, the concept of leprechauns, the concept of gnomes and sylphs or salamanders, angels, that was there. It was there as part of that reality. It existed. But I think that part of there's been a contraction that's going on, that's been taking place for the last few thousand years, where now we need to take something like DMT to even open up those doors of perception. But in a natural state, more atavistic state, those doors are there for, and that's really, and I think it has to do with their left-right brain hemispheric, the left brain hemispheric dominance. So
you coming back here to the argument of people like Julian Jaynes and everything else.
Exactly.
Which brings in, I would love to bring in Sarah now. Normally at this point, I always bring Sarah in because she always sits there and she analyzes what we're talking about and comes in with some incredible comments.
Yes.
So come on, Sarah, join in.
Oh, there's loads of things. Like everything you're saying, Daniel, I really agree with, just completely wholeheartedly. It's amazing. And me and Anthony have said so many times, and it's a big passion of mine, that fiction and novels and films are the best way to present new ideas, because they're fully absorbed by the audience in a way that, like you say, a very dry academic paper just doesn't touch the surface. One of the things that I wanted to bring up is when you were talking about empathy towards androids, it reminded me of, I host my own little lecture club, and one of the lecturers I had was a specialist in AI, and he was talking about, a lot of his work is around the morals and ethics of AI. And he was talking about sex robots in particular.
Oh, not you and your sex robots. No.
So yeah, he was talking about whether people should marry or engage with sex robots, because they might not treat them as well as they would treat other people, because they have feelings. And that this idea of empathy can kind of work the other way. Whereas, like you say, we're desensitized to violence. And so we are more likely to see other people as not human necessarily, dehumanize them in some way, so we find it easier to be cruel to them. So this was a big question for him, is whether if people were allowed to have a lot of sex robots and they could look more and more like real people, would they be abusive to them, or would they like marry them and buy them nice presents and stuff like that?
Well, that's something that the Japanese will have an answer for, because it seems like the sex robot industries is flourishing in Japan. And it really is, I think it's a commentary on the impoverishment of men and women relationships. It's terrible. This is an example where we're looking at to have technology replace human relations. Now, I can understand in their very specific circumstances, you might need a sex robot, but the idea, the concept is we reached such a level that we cannot even talk to each other without a kind of a technology chaperone. It's absurd, but yet that's the new reality, at least in some parts of the world. So yes, I think we should be very concerned about that, because there is a creeping quality to the way technology, it's almost like the serpent, going back to the biblical. It wants to seduce us. Now, I'm not saying, I'm not a Luddite here. In fact, we're very much using technology, but we technology we should be the master of the technology, not the other way around. So the minute you introduce something like robots or to the general population, without really understanding why there are so many people who are lonely out there, right? Why do they need a robot? Can they just meet someone? And if that's not happening, why? What's stopping us? From a macro point of view, we are failing human beings from a macro point of view. Talking about individually, there may be some awakened people, but as a culture, I don't believe we're winning the war. I think that what I refer to as the corporate monolithic monoculture is taking over. And essentially, I mean, when people say, "Oh, Blade Runner is just a movie," oh, really? Well, let's talk about Amazon. Amazon is the new Blade. Well, it's become the new Tyrell Corporation. You know, I was shocked to find out that the four companies, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Amazon, run close to 25% of the U.S. economy. 4 companies. And while Amazon was able to amass grow bigger than ever, and Bezos is worth over $200 billion, a lot of people really suffered during this pandemic. So we're heading toward, there's a difference though between Blade Runner and where we're going. Blade Runner is so extreme, there are no, how could there be any customers for Tyrell? Everybody's broke.
Yes.
Whereas, you see, they don't want that. They don't want people to be so broke that they're actually, because there'll be no customers. They want everybody to be on the dole or some sort of program where you're giving them a little bit of money so he can feed it back to us, create codependency. And that's really and Philip was totally against that. A lot of his characters are just average, everyday people that are dealing with these challenges that are come from these megalithic corporations that are trying to crush the human spirit. So that's why, going back to the issue of the robots, before we start arguing about the ethics of whether or not we should abuse a robot or not, we should start thinking, why should we even go there? And with some exceptions, and there clearly are some exceptions. What about our society is creating this need for a robot?
Well, I think I was talking to Anthony before we went live about Philip K. Dick's essay, if you find this world bad, you should try some of the others. And him believing that he was simultaneously experiencing this Christian man's life 2,000 years ago, and that he had to promote these ideas to stop our world from going along the Blade Runner type route. Yes,
I believe that. He did have those strange experiences where he felt he was in first century Rome, and it's truly quite an interesting take on a parallel universe that we're. And it's very possible. I'm not ruling it out. Remember what Jesus says, that we will not, generation will not pass before I return. So according to Phil, that makes sense. We're still in first century Rome. That Jesus died 20 years ago, and this is being a huge simulation that's created by the Lord of the Shadows. It's very odd. It's really going on. And but Phil, the one thing about Phil was that he really never fully was absorbed by any one system. He kept questioning reality. Again, the constant interrogation of reality to get to a point. And that's really what I give him credit for, because he could have easily created a religion, or at least hooked up with someone else and say, hey, we're going to call the religion, our new God is Valles, or Valles is the messenger of our new God or new prophet.
Well, that moves us in, actually, because there was something I was wanting to move on to from that, which is the concept of Ubik.
Yes. What about it?
In terms of it mixes together kind of consumerism.
Yes.
And of course, Ubik is ubiquitous and everything else as well. And again, it's an idea, isn't it, that consumerism is taking over in some way, that everybody really needs this substance. And again, I can't remember which novel it was where there is, is it Perky Pat? Where everybody lives in this kind of this drug-induced world, a little bit like Aldous Huxley in The Island, that everybody sort of exists in this hypothetical world where they have Perky Pat dolls. And it's coming back to what Sarah was saying about sex dolls, because that's what he talks about in that, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does talk about it a bit. The idea of how consumerism is becoming kind of a new religion, has become a new religion. We're definitely in a very unique place right now. I think some people are being called to be awakened, but the vast majority of the population is not. They're going in the opposite direction. I had a discussion with you interviewed her, Dr. Powell.
Oh, Diane, she's my next guest. I want to get on here soon. Diane Powell, amazing. Yes.
Absolutely. Why isn't this a front page? No.
Exactly. The stuff she is doing is extraordinary, and nobody knows about it.
It's not made into a film yet. We need to make it into films.
Sarah, yet again, let's do our film company. Yeah. Yeah, but I was only thinking about Diane Powell. It's weird. I was only thinking about Diane Hennessy Powell this morning. And I was thinking, what was her name? I was trying to remember because I need to contact her because I invited her on this show and she said she'd love to come. And I thought, I've got to get back to her to give her a date.
Because you had her a couple of months back. So I saw your interview with her. She's absolutely brilliant. And this idea that we have this potential, and it's mostly exhibited in savants, but it's there, it's still latent in all human beings. Absolutely, the fact that she may be able to create a series of experimental evidence-based protocols to demonstrate the existence of ESP or some sort of precognition, or she should be getting grants, should be getting funding to make that happen. Apparently, she started this project back in 2015, the telepathy project.
Yes.
And I was originally, she wanted to raise $500,000. She's raised about 10,000. I mean, it's bizarre.
I know. The thing is, as well, that there are very much links with this to this podcast, because Sarah probably will not be aware of this, but a previous guest before Diane Hennessy Powell was Dr. Darrell Trefford. And Darrell Trefford was the person who facilitated the contact between Diane Hennessy Powell and the young Indian child that was proving telepathic. And of course, Darrell Trefford...
Haley, right? The young Indian child.
Correct.
Haley.
Now, Darrell Trefford himself, he sadly died about 6 months ago, so I wanted to get him back on this show, because he was the technical advisor for the movie Rain Man, because he's an expert on Savant syndrome. And he's written a series of books on Savant syndrome, which again I discuss in 2 or 3 of my books, because Savant syndrome itself is fascinating. And again, you think, we're getting back into Philip K. Dick territory here.
Absolutely.
Aren't we? The idea of knowing everything or being aware of what's going on. And of course, we then go straight back to Borges, because we have the Borges short story Funes the Memorias, where there's somebody who knows everything. Now, this is where Sarah and I, and if you haven't had the opportunity to watch this, both Daniel and the audience as well, check back and go onto my my YouTube site and look back to a previous guest, a young Australian woman who has Savant syndrome with balls on, if I can use that term. It's extraordinary, wasn't it, Sarah? The thing that she did live on our program. You can explain it, Sarah, because it was extraordinary, wasn't it?
Well, I think that she's got highly superior autobiographical memory, so she can remember everything. I think they have to be kind of emotional, personal events that have happened in her life, but she can remember everything, and then she can attach that to a calendar date and a time. And she says she can remember being in the womb. She can remember all of her dreams. She's lucid in all of her dreams. And so it goes, someone like that can really explain a lot about nature and memory and reality and how it works and why we think the way we think, because she can recall where every thought comes from and where every idea and dream comes from.
Sometimes I feel that this podcast is in the center of a vortex. And everything is coming together here, and we say this every time. But Daniel, this has just been absolutely extraordinary, this discussion. Philip K. Dick, it's the main theme that we're talking about, but the areas we've already gone into, I imagine there's going to be people out there in the chat room, because I can see they're bouncing up and down with interest in the things we're talking about. Because
about Philip's strange life as well, because I was talking to Anthony before. I have read a lot of Philip K. Dick books, but I hadn't really looked much into his life, and his life is fascinating. And you can see that he would have been primed for weird experiences in a way, like the fact that he had a twin sister that died when she was, I think, 6 weeks old, right. That the tombstone that they made for the baby had his name already on it, and his middle name was Kindred. It sounds like he probably suffered from schizophrenia and had these quite tumultuous relationships. And then the experience that he had when he was given truth serum, essentially, when he had his wisdom tooth extracted, and those incredible experiences he had then. Anthony, you've written a book about him, so you know a lot about his personal life. But he's an incredibly interesting character. And like you were saying, Daniel, your kind of name often becomes this becomes this format for the life that you lead, and he had all of this stuff already kind of programmed into him.
Yeah, I mean, the jury is still out what exactly happened, that he had a psychotic break, too many drugs, and so on. I believe he just had an imaginal experience. Not unlike, say, Whitley Strieber, we talked about this, or Toynbee, or Robert Anton Wilson, and so on. I don't believe it. It might have been facilitated by his some stress and some previous drug use, but even by his own admission, Philip K. Dick really did not take much. I think he might have used acid once in his whole life. He was a big amphetamine user, so was Ayn Rand. So everybody thinks, well, Ayn Rand took tons of poppers or amphetamines as well. It was no big deal back in the 60s. So was Phil. In fact, he had to do that to write so much. But something happens when you start writing and writing. There's a point that doors swing wide open from your unconscious, and stuff comes out automatically. You don't need no.
I do think that sort of creative imagination is hugely underrated, and actually, if you have that kind of creative imagination, and like you say, he was writing all the time and he was imagining all of these scenarios, when you close your eyes, when you're in those liminal states during hypnagogia, you really start to see quite elaborate scenes and have incredibly intricate imaginings. And I can well imagine that would have been something that inspired and was just a byproduct of his imagination.
Which then comes back to it, doesn't it? The point we were making before, the idea that if you are an intensely creative person, the creativity imbues your overall external phaneron, as Charles Peirce called it, the created world that is your world. If these things leap through from... Now, previous guests, when we're talking about Charles Bonnet syndrome with Neil a few weeks ago, and of course, even with Rebecca, and the things that in her world are really, really intriguing. And again, this is evidence that there seems to be this overlap. Now, I remember Tessa, when I was talking to Tessa, when I was doing Tessa Dick, Philip K. Dick's fifth wife, and she was saying to me, when we were talking about 2374, which was the incidents when he had his theophany and everything else as well, and he began to perceive what he called Valles, or he called various other terms, that he called this something that had come into his life. And as Tessa said to me, she said he was a writer. He was an intensely creative person. And sometimes his creativity imbued his world with this kind of incredible fiction. But this is the question, isn't it? That in my book, The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, I discuss creativity. So what is really happening when people are creative? Because I've got so many examples of creative writers, and Philip K. Dick was a classic example of this. Individuals who write about things in a novel, and then 5 or 6 years later, they find themselves experiencing what they wrote about in their previous novel. And this is why I called the book Philip K. Dick, A Life of Philip K. Dick, The Man Who Remembered the Future. Because it seems to be as if he was back creating, rather like we were talking before about information going backwards in time, that certain individuals can be aware of their own future and can create that future in their own past as part of a fiction.
Yes.
And it is intriguing. Now, I'm fascinated about the theme we're going on, but there was something that you also wanted to talk about that I really am keen to focus in on now, which is your fascination with the Wizard of Oz as well. So can we...
Oh, yes. Well, that's back in 2018. We did something here in New York City called the Cosmodrome, which was a multimedia presentation of film and stage and motivational seminar. So the Wizard of Oz, I think, is another, just like 2001, just like Blade Runner. They all really, the unifying factor is this idea there is an underlying reality. The underlying reality that the current reality is just in what I refer to it as an incomplete, not necessarily negative, but an incomplete version of the full reality. We see it through certain filters, and then we apply a certain more realistic, whether it's bad or good, But the Wizard of Oz clearly exemplifies that. It's It's almost like there's a hidden hand that is showing us that there's something beyond this world. And it's asking us to peer behind the curtain and look at examine. We're the Wizard of Oz is very important because this was a way. Some people believe that the writer was very much part of what is referred to as the mystery tradition, going back to the 1800s, to the or even beforehand, to the Rosicrucians and so on.
Well, so Frank L. Baum could have been part of the modern day mystical tradition, you're saying, yeah?
It might have been, yes. There being some speculation that he might have been part of that, and he wanted to introduce it within a framework that people could understand. Because had he written about it, people say, "Oh, he's just another philosopher or another psychologist and so on." But introducing it, this is the subversive aspect of in a positive way of science fiction. Introduces the concepts who ordinarily we wouldn't even consider, we wouldn't even think about. We would say this is just crazy. But now it's shown to us in an immersive environment, whether it be in a book or in a movie, that makes it more acceptable. So it seems like there are various influences. Some of these influences want us to move forward in time or in our consciousness to an awakening, and others don't want that. They want us to remain basically consumers and to keep buying the stuff that nobody really wants, but we still buy it because they're really good at entrainment technologies, a way of using technology to really seduce our senses into something we really don't want. So they're almost like two opposing camps here. And that's really always has been the issue. For instance, I'll give you another example that has struck me. We clearly know a lot of people in the world that are very gifted, yet many of them are not on top of the food chain. They're not doing that well. Many of them are marginalized, but yet the people who are on top of the food chain are often not this. They may be gifted in other ways, and probably in marketing, but not necessarily in offering things to the world that we can that the world can benefit from. And it's a question that I've been thinking about for a long time. Say remote viewers, the remote viewing experiments back in the 70s. Well, how is it these guys are not really able to remote view? And many of them are relatively successful, but they're not doing that great. Correct. So I actually had Hal Puthoff. He was and I asked him, well, he mentioned about this experiment he did back in the 90s where he was able to short the silver market and they made $100,000. So my question is, why aren't you doing this on a regular basis? What's going on here?
Because that was a central, in my book, The Out of Body Experience, I focused in on remote viewing, and I had a whole chapter on remote viewers. And this was the question I continually asked, was that either you can do it or you can't. If you claim you can do it automatically, you should just be able to get out your body or remote view something and bring information back. But the thing is with remote viewers, they were consistently, and people who have out-of-the-body experience as well, were consistently 80 or 90% right. Sometimes less, but they would bring out some information. But it seemed that the worlds again they were going to, the world outside that they were travelling in within the remote viewing world, I argue, is almost always a creation of their own subconscious in some way. But it also has elements of external knowledge as well. For instance, who was the guy that was in the experiments with Puthoff and Targ and various other people?
Oh, Ingo Swann.
Ingo Swann. And Ingo Swann, when Ingo Swann claimed that he'd gone to Jupiter, he was following one of the mariners or something, and he claimed he got to Jupiter, and when he was and I mentioned this in the book, and he says in Jupiter that he could see the volcanoes coming out of the clouds of Jupiter. Now, there are no volcanoes on Jupiter, and if those volcanoes were there, they would have been huge because Jupiter is a gas giant, and if there is a surface inside, anything coming from the surface out to the edge of the atmosphere and the clouds would be massive, huge, and yet One of the actual moons of Jupiter, and I cannot remember, Europa, I think it is. I may be wrong on this, but I think it's Europa, is the most volcanic object in the solar system. And was it he'd seen that and confused it in some way for thinking it was Jupiter? You know, and these things are extremely intriguing, aren't they? And again, is this again an extrapolation of this developing model of the egregorial, the idea that we self-create our world, and when we have out-of-the-body experiences, when we lucid dream, we're going to within this amalgamation world that's a little bit of our expectations, but also a little bit of reality as well?
Well, I think, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think a lot of it is often we need to create alternative selves, so alternative narratives, because if we were to truly begin to appreciate our power, for a lot of us, it's just overwhelming. So I think the idea that we stop ourselves short. That's my argument from truly using these powers. This is a kind of almost an adaptive response, because knowing these powers would basically lead us somewhere that we don't want to go. Hence, we create these narratives like, well, no, I saw it in my dream. We can do it at will. It's just like the character from Ursula K. Le Guin. Then it would be very different. So it's easy to be seduced by other narratives telling us that this is the way you're supposed to be. I mean, the concept of the remote viewing, the precogs, let's say, right? That's exactly what you had 3 or 4 remote viewing agents at Fort Meade, right? And they were doing this. They were gathering intel. They were going to see what's going on inside that sub. It's very similar to what Philip had us seen in the 3 precogs, except they're actually floating on water and you're in a Minority Report. It's very similar, you know. It's more dramatic than just 3 guys just like writing stuff on a room with no.
Yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think what we're doing, and we do this all the time, we misinterpret what we think. We put it into our structures and our expectations. And just a very quick point, yes, I did remember it was Io, but thanks Danny for that. And I was Danny Torbeck has told me this, yeah, and it was Io, and I was about to say it was Io. And it was to do with the rings of Jupiter that he'd seen, but he actually turned around and said the rings were coming out of the planet. He didn't actually say they were rings either, which is the interesting thing. But this whole topic we're now really, it's really, really intriguing, this, I think. And one of the things, again, you picked upon there is somebody else that I want as a future guest here is a lady called Jenny Randalls, who's a very popular UFO writer in the UK. And Jenny has something she calls the Oz factor, which is that kind of weird atmospheric conditions, which are kind of quasi-psychological, but also quasi-external to yourself when extraordinary things take place. For instance, when there was the famous time slip, I think in 1905, in the Tuileries Gardens in Versailles, when Mrs. Moberly and Mrs. whatever the other woman's name was, they had a time slip. And they said that the atmosphere was electric. And people talk about this a lot as if there's this kind of electric tension in the air, that your hair stands on end or whatever. And I know Phil talked about this a lot as well in his writings, particularly within the exegesis. And he talks about this kind of electrical fizz that people have.
It's very interesting you bring that up, because I wanted to actually bring this up.
Moberly and Jourdan, wasn't it? It was Moberly and Jourdan.
In our last, I had, for instance, a series of during the pandemic, I've been doing a lot of meditation. I've been doing a lot of exploring borderline states of consciousness and so on. But I noticed a couple of things a few months back. I just finished reading. I was reading something on Whitley Strieber and the Visitors, and then I fell asleep. But I didn't quite fall asleep. That was the thing. I sort of like the light was on. I close my eyes, and all of a sudden, I see this lamp, the lamp in front of me, slightly to the right, but I'm eyes closed. Wow. And then I begin to feel this evil presence start creeping up behind it. I don't see it now, but I feel there's something there that it's really terrifying. Lastly, I feel that there's a part. there is it's almost like I'm being sucked in by a magnetic field, the right side. So I woke up like a few minutes later and realized at that moment kind of reminded me of those experiments that had been conducted. I'm not sure. I think Persinger on and where they're stimulating the various lobes. And I began to connect the dots and realize at that point this might be an electromagnetic shift in my brain, because there was the evil presence, but also it's almost like one part of my brain was being pulled by a magnetic, specifically magnetic activity, you know.
And of course, that would be your temporal lobes as well, and it would be your right temporal lobe, which is ectree, because that's where Persinger particularly focused with his God helmet.
There's another thing that I noticed. This is, again, these discoveries this year. It's really absolutely, I'm thrilled. I fall asleep, and then right before I fall asleep, right before I have to start dreaming, I see inside my mind parts different. Like it was almost like a white screen opens up, and I see different. It's a black screen, but then certain parts begin to light up, almost like thunder, electrical activity. But it's not. I'm not seeing thunder, but I'm seeing things that appear to be. It's almost like white shadow, white images appear, and this is inside my mind. I call it the mind screen. And again, and the last one was, this is part of my exploration. I remember this one night I had a really hard time falling asleep, and all of a sudden I'm thrusted into a world. There are 1,000 voices all speaking at the same time, and I said, "What is going on here?" Kind of reminded me of the movie X-Men, and with the professor wore this helmet, and when he wore this helmet, he could hear all the voices of the world at once at the same time. So my experience at that moment was I had to step in and affirm my voice, and then as soon as I stepped in, they're all like children, all speaking but not children, they're adults. So, but I had to step in and say, "Hey, I'm here," and all of a sudden the voices vanished, or at least quell. But it's quite an experience. And I was, again, these are borderline states of consciousness that we're accessing, or I've accessed, and I think that we all do all the time.
Sarah, because your work on lucid dreaming and everything else as well, you can come in here on your ideas, because that was quite fascinating what Daniel was talking about there.
Well, actually, I'm really interested in the magnetoreception element of it, because one of the things I found very interesting when I've been doing some research into lucid dreaming and different states of consciousness is the effect of electromagnetic forces on the mind and on consciousness. And there are more incidences of psychotic breaks during electromagnetic storm activity or geomagnetic storm activity, and more admissions to hospital, more heart attacks. Like, it certainly has an effect on the human physiology. And one thing that I find interesting is that our magnetosphere, the power of it's been diminishing on a kind of steady downward curve, which has happened a lot throughout the history of the Earth, but it's fluctuating. It's still quite mysterious what causes it, because it fluctuates so much. It can go up and it go down, but it's been on a steady kind of downward curve for ages. And about 40,000 years ago, it had been the magnetosphere would have been much more powerful. So I do wonder whether that could have impacted human consciousness to some extent during that time frame, and that as the magnetosphere is weakened, we've become less attuned maybe to that power within the Earth.
That is fascinating, isn't it? The telluric forces. I'm reminded here of the writings of people like Paul Devereux, and the idea of earth lights and everything else as well. You're very, very intriguing here, I think. So moving on, in terms of, let's continue with this thing. I'm really quite intrigued by your hypnagogic experiences as well. Because Phil regularly talked about hypnagogic imagery and the way he saw the library of books in front of him at one stage during his theophany and various other things. Right. And of course, that's where we had our joking thing about Anarch Peake, isn't it? Maybe you can explain the Anarch Peake thing this time.
You mention it. This is there you go.
There it is. Yeah, Counterclock World.
Anarch Peake. I looked at it right there. Anarch Peake. I'm writing actually a book called The Theater of the Mind. And we have inside our own mind, the old expression, mind's eye, right? And this is from work study, conversations I had with Robert Anton Wilson and also other explorers of human consciousness. The idea is that we have and routinely use this theater of the mind to make certain experiences more palatable and others less palatable. Um, I've studied that certain fields like general semantics, neurolinguistics, and so on, and found that with these technologies, we're able to access what I refer to as these tools of liberation. So we can see more on the other side of the fence, so to speak. I'm going to segue here with PTSD. Uh, Dr. Powell has a project. We call it PTSD project, and one thing that interested me a lot is about the impact of PTSD on our veterans and our soldiers. And currently, the paradigm is to move them from therapy to MDMA or some sort of medication. And I believe that's actually not scalable. That is, although MDMA therapy has a lot of merit, it's not scalable to deal with the millions of veterans and other and men and women that have PTSD. So there's a system called it's called the rewind therapy, where essentially we take an experience that we had and we watch it from various perspectives, and we literally take that experience and rewind it. We fast forward the experience very quickly from a third party perspective. We see ourselves watch the movie and then we rewind it. And I've done it myself with some of my clients, and a lot of the PTSD just disappears. It's just canceled. So how this is connected to Philip K. Dick and Robert Anton Wilson is that he believed that we had these tools of liberation that exist inside our mind. We just haven't tapped into them. And instead, we're being told, no, we got to take this drug or we got to go on this ayahuasca retreat. For instance, Timothy Leary, towards the end of his life, had a series of conversations with this other writer. His name is Robert Dilts. And he explored the idea of the imprint experience. So originally, LSD was useful under the right setting, the right dose. In fact, some of the early Timothy Leary experiments, he demonstrated that with a group of men who were alcoholics, and that after their LSD experiment, they no longer were interested in drinking. However, it was abused and exploited and misused by the public and many others. But the idea of an imprint experience, take the person to a moment in time when they originally had that horrible experience, whether it be PTSD or a terrible belief. So Timothy Leary came to believe that it's possible to access those imprint experiences without LSD, through the theater of the mind, through this kind of world that exists inside of us.
Would that be the same as EMDR, that kind of therapy?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about EMDR. This is a little story that nobody shares. The developer is Francine Shapiro, and she actually worked for John Grinder years ago. She was his secretary or executive assistant. John Grinder and Richard Bandler talked about these techniques back in the early 70s. How to remove phobias in a matter of minutes or an hour. Now, she later claimed, quote unquote, that she developed EMDR on her own by just watching how her eyes moved along the lines. It's not EMDR, although there's a correlation, because EMDR works for some people. This actually enables you to run your own films inside your own head, except you're the writer, producer, and director of your own films, rather than someone else stepping in. So all the great quotations, like such as starting with Shakespeare, as we are actors, on this stage called life, that's very much true, except it's also happening in our own inner world. So we can access these powers through metaphors like the theater of the mind. It's just a metaphor. but it's a good metaphor because if you look at mystics such as Saint Teresa of Avila, she used the metaphor of a castle, going inside the castle and finding God. Well, castles at that time were very commonplace. Not anymore. Now we have movie theaters. So a better metaphor would be a theater of the mind where we can go and start exploring the inner worlds of our mind. So there exists a correlation between Robert Anton Wilson, the theater of the mind, and Philip K. Dick. And this is really one of the areas that I'm exploring right now because I do feel that's where he was heading. Unfortunately, his life was cut short by stroke in his early 50s.
Did Phil ever meet Robert Anton Wilson?
Yes, they were good friends.
All right. Can you tell us a little bit about anything you know about that? Because that would have been a fascinating meeting of minds.
Yeah, let me just grab a quick cup of water because my mouth is a little dry. Just in 1 sec, I'll be right back.
Well, we've got another classic here, Sarah.
Yeah, this is brilliant. This is really like the culmination of a lot of the talks that we've had recently. Actually,
that's what I find extraordinary, is the way in which the themes that we've been following up, it is almost as if, you know, we are being guided. It's silly to say that we're being guided in some way, but it's just that Diane Hennessy Powell thing is weird, because it was literally, I was thinking, Diane Hennessy Powell, what was her name? What was her name? And I need to contact her. And I was going to be doing this an hour ago, you know, incredible. Okay, so
that would be a good sci-fi writer fiction name, actually, wouldn't it? Diane.
It would. Absolutely. So, Daniel, going back, so Robert Anton Wilson and Philip K. Dick.
So, yes, they actually, there's a great book by Robert Anton, I think it's called Cosmic Trigger Part 2, Down to Earth, the Final Secret of the Illuminati. So they met. I mean, when Philip K. Dick had the 2374 experiences, that's when he met Robert Anton Wilson. They had a couple of meetings. And it turned out that Robert Anton Wilson also had a series of telepathic communications with some sort of being from Sirius.
Yes.
And Philip, shared his own experiences with him, and he felt that, no, you're not crazy. We just happen to be connecting with this particular star system or being.
Because this is interesting, because a previous guest on the show is Bill Sarrell. And it was Bill Sarrell, I think, was it the Divine Invasions? Or was it one of the other kind of quasi-religious novels he wrote that both of them wrote together? Because I'm thinking, for instance, Robert Anton Wilson, one of the things that I picked up about him was, and I mentioned this, I think, in Opening the Doors of Perception, whereby he had something called leperology, where people turn around and they see rabbits. And of course, then this rings right back, and Sarah will pick this up straight away, because a future show we're going to be having is on Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, because again, you have the symbol of the rabbit. And again, a previous guest on this show, again, a guy that lives in LA, is a guy called Myron Dial. And Myron has had a series of extraordinary experiences with elementals. In and in Retrievo Park, I think it is, in LA. And again, I've written about Myron. If you get the chance again, if anybody's watching this and is interested in looking at this, because there's so many themes now that Daniel has stimulated here in this discussion that have been literally preceded, losing that term in its precise sense, it was preceded from previous shows we've had here. It's quite incredible, really.
On the issue of Lewis Carroll, in fact, when I wrote and wrote The Final Equation, one of I use a few things from Robert Anton Wilson, is two expressions. Who is the master that makes the grass green? He starts off with that. It's a cryptic kind of, and for those who are not familiar, that's a Zen koan or koan. That pronunciation.
I always say koan, but I don't know how you pronounce it.
There is a way. But essentially, it's a way to understand that we are the master. We create. We are the ones who attribute it. But who is the master that makes the grass green? And that the character tries to figure out what is this. But behind that is this encrypted code that enables him to solve the final equation. But also in the middle of the movie, I introduce Go Ask Alice, this idea of Alice in Wonderland, of it's a world within a world. So it's amazing that you bring that up because that's
Yeah, can you tell us more about your movies then? Because clearly you've made a number of movies that really, I'm sure that an awful lot of people here would be quite interested to check out. Tell us more about this.
As it turned out, just like Blade Runner, we've made multiple cuts. The final equation is the final cut. I'll be showing out of competition at the festival this year. For those who have never seen it before, but
Apocalypse Now. It's like Apocalypse Now, the final cut, right?
The final cut.
Or Blade Runner, yeah.
I remember reading hearing Jodorowsky talk about El Topo, which was an amazing film, and he did a couple of cuts, but this one we've been doing cuts for the last few years. The first cut was so obtuse that most people didn't get it. They watched it, we showed it, and they felt they didn't get it. So we made a couple of cuts to make it more accessible, because it's almost like a Chinese box, a box within a box within a box within a box, and unless you follow the rabbit trail, you just don't get it. So we felt it was a little bit too abstract for most people. So instead, the second cut was a little bit more user friendly, you see, or people friendly. And now the final cut is actually I made some minor changes in the beginning and in the end, but overall it retains basically the same narrative, the same theme. But the idea is that the character realizes that he's living in a dream state. He's awakening from that dream state. The final equation, which seems to be the main theme, is actually just another transit to the reality that awaits him at the very end of the film. So he begins to, he's a man who's lost faith in God. When he saw dealing with the issues of his daughter, he has a sister who dies when she's like 6, 7 years old. And now this is before I knew about Philip K. Dick. And he felt his whole life had been thrown. It was a younger sister who was a believer, and she dies very young. And since that moment, he rejected religion. So and he started to embrace science as the paradigm to explain all reality. And that the final equation would be the final answer that drives people, that the ultimate equation. So he encounters a mystic, who actually turns out to be a messenger, who explains that we're all searching for the same thing. We're just using different words. But nevertheless, that he has to go his own way to find the answer, to search for the ultimate source of creation. And he encounters it, but to his surprise, not what he thought it was. And while this is happening, his world around him is literally collapsing. It's imploding. He's reaching a personal singularity. So we at the very end of the film begin to understand that his quest has been a spiritual quest, even though it's shrouded in different terms with science and physics and so on. It's a spirit. One question that people always ask, if God is so nice, so just, how is it that he allows suffering in the world? That there cannot be a God. But you see, God has given us free will, and he's created a world where suffering is allowed. It's not like, otherwise there would be no free. This is one thing about Rudolf Steiner talks about, the concept of free will. We are allowed to descend, and we need to ascend back to the Godhead. Well, the Kabbalists talk about the same thing, about returning the 55,000 sparks back to the Godhead.
Yeah, the shards, the broken shards of the broken containers. Yeah, because funnily enough, because that again is fascinating, because you were taking us back now to Vedanta. You're taking us back to the idea of the embodiment of Brahman within the universe, within everybody's individual Atman, which is fascinating. What is the movie called the final equation?
It's called The Final Equation. Yes.
And how would people acquire copies of this? How would they be able to get it and watch it?
Well, the film will be available for after the festival. We'll have it ready for download or for video on demand. At this point, I still don't have it ready because we're in the process of recutting it.
Okay. This is the
And
perfect opportunity now for you to tell us about this year's festival, what's going to be happening and what are you doing, and tell us a little bit more about it, because I'm really interested in this, what you're doing.
well, one of the things about our festival are the panels. We really love the panels. We feel the panels are, you know, we have some great films, and some of our films have gone on to be accepted. Say we had a film that 2 years ago called Volition that now was picked up by Showtime, and it will be shown you know, I guess on by Showtime real soon. So I'm going to be interviewing the director. But the panels always seem to be very well attended because they really represent some of the central themes of Philip K. Dick. And the panels this year have to do with one of them has to do with the field effect. It's called The Field. It's a documentary called The Field. We're exploring the field of consciousness that seems to pervade our reality. There's a panel on robotics. There is one on something called deep fake therapy, which is it's very interesting. The director wrote a script, or the idea was that in the future, technology is so advanced that now we can bring back our those we've lost and have a conversation, a closure conversation with those people, a virtualized version of that. So let's say you lose someone, and then you can now tell them how you felt. But this is an interesting thing about it. He wrote a short, so sci-fi short, but some psychologists begin to realize, hey, my God, this is something we can use right now. So right now in the Netherlands, there is something called deep fake therapy. It's exactly that, which is the idea of creating an environment where we can have closure for those who have prematurely lost our loved ones. We never said goodbye to them. We never say, I love you. We never say any of those things. Now you can do it in this virtual environment. So this is going to be short. It's kind of like documentary, but is it really a documentary or is it reality? So that's the interesting thing. So that's we receive a huge number of submissions. We're still judging them right now. We have a group of programmers, and we are exploring most of them we have a screenplay competition, because I do believe that a lot of it is writing is the key. And that's why we felt there were too many films that we submitted that were based on splashy visual effects and the writing wasn't strong enough. I mean, if you really want good writing, go back to the old literature, not just some more effects. And so we are encouraging that kind of good writing through our competition. So we're hoping to have a nice selection of films and documentaries as part of this program.
And will you be doing it live rather than virtual as well? You're hoping that lockdown will have closed.
Yeah, that all depends upon the filmmakers. I mean, we get their permission. Some filmmakers are very hopefully most of them will go along with it. There's some that might not want to have a live version. They may be geo-blocking to only New York City because they may want the film to be shown live in, say, in England or wherever. So it all depends.
Okay, and final question then. In terms of the panels historically, which are the ones that stand out and you think, no, that was really great? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, one of the ones that I'm really very proud of is the back in 2017, or 2016, 2017, we had a panel on remote viewing. It was on INCON017. And we had Jacques Valles there.
Wow.
Yes, he was Jacques Valles, Hal Puthoff, and it was great. I mean, and we had one panel on INCON017, and we had on one panel on based on a documentary called Gods Among Us, featuring Carolyn Corey. You might have seen her. She's now a regular on the Ancient Aliens program.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, but it had Rudy Child was in it. Now, Rudy Child, you familiar with Rudy Child?
Oh, yes, I am.
Yeah. He was there, and we talked about the phenomenon, the ET phenomenon. What does it mean? How can we relate to that? What's going on? And She has a
This is with Ray Hernandez, isn't it? Doesn't he work with Ray Hernandez on this?
Yes.
Yeah, because they wanted me involved in that when they first started setting it up,
Right.
and I've sort of backed off slightly, which I shouldn't have done. But of course, with all the other things I've been involved in, I can't spread myself any thinner, really. But your panels sound absolutely intriguing. So I'm aware of the fact we're coming towards the end of our 2 hours now, and as ever, 2 hours has just flashed by. Now I am absolutely 100% sure there are going to be people out there that are going to want to know your contact details and everything, because I'm just keeping an eye on the debates and discussions that are going on in the chat room, and I have to say it's really terrific. And sorry guys that sometimes we can't draw you in. But sometimes I don't think we need to, because you're talking to each other all the time, which is so important, because we're trying to build a community here. And the way we do this is by you guys, because there's so many people on that I know from years, and I've known for many, many years. And it's great seeing people who don't know each other now chatting away to each other in the chat room, which is just what we're trying to do here. So if you can let everybody know how they contact you and everything else as well, and how they get involved or they know more about the festival, because there are people who will be listening in who will be living in the New York area as well. So please fire away.
Okay, so the festival is the website is the Philip K. Dick Film Festival with THE, the Philip K. Dick Film Festival.com. And that's probably the best way if you want to be part of our mailing list. Just go there and just sign up. If you want any questions, you want to address any questions regarding final equation or the festival or anything else we discussed about, you can shoot me an email, info@thephilipkdickfilmfestival.com.
Well, thank you, Daniel. That has been extraordinary. I mean, every show that we do, I can't say they're getting better because that's unfair, but they're all different and they're all powerful and they are all really make you think. And I thoroughly enjoy this, and I'm sure that Sarah would echo that. Any final points you'd like to make, Sarah, before we wend our weary way?
Oh, I just wanted to ask Daniel what he thought of Blade Runner 2049, because me and Anthony hated it.
Yeah, go on, yeah.
Honestly, I didn't care for it.
Yes!
Good, that's three of us.
Vindication. I had so many arguments with people.
I have to force myself to watch it. Honestly, it was it's not the same. In fact, that's an unfortunate trend with a lot of filmmakers today. They start really good, like Blade Runner 2049 is first of all, it's way too long. It's running against people's AD. People have less. Their attention span is less, not more. So forcing us to sit through a 3-hour film is brutal, no matter how good it is. I mean, I had to force myself to watch Prometheus, and they're missing the point. Right now, a lot of our wisdom is internal. Like all those gods, you see these cave paintings, say Diane Powell talks about it. That's here. That's not out there. People missing the point. The wisdom is inside. So the original is, in my opinion, Kami and is much better.
Absolutely. One of my Facebook friends and somebody that's done a film with a mutual friend of Sarah and I, Jason Fighty, is Sean Young. And you know, sometime in the future maybe we'll get Sean on here to talk about this. But she was telling, or was she telling me, or she was telling somebody, a mutual friend, I think, about the way they recreated her for the movie, which was a curious idea. I think it probably worked, but I still think in film, one of the greatest pieces of film, I think, is when Rachel first enters and walks across and says, "Do you like our owl?" And that is just priceless. Sean looks absolutely stunning, and it's just wonderful. I mean, it's a wonderful film. You can't replace films like that. I don't know why they ever do this, and it does annoy me sometimes. But anyway, okay, thanks everybody. Sarah, thank you again for your support as always.
I'll virtually meet you, Daniel.
Yeah, absolutely, Daniel. We'll stay in contact, and we are discussing about trying to get either virtually or actually in the UK an event down at Sarah's beautiful seaside resort that she lives in down on the south coast of England. She was telling me a few days ago it's one of the few places where you can actually see the sunrise and the sunset over the sea, which is...
that's awesome.
That sounds incredible, doesn't it?
Yes.
So what we'll try and do is we'll try and get that together at some time in the future. But anyway, again, thanks everybody for listening in, and we will see you all next Monday for another Consciousness Hour epic. Thank you very much.
Thank
Cheers.
You, Sarah and Anthony. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.